It was a brilliant spring morning in Maplewood, a small American town surrounded by tranquility and quaint charm. I, Jack O'Connor, was on my morning patrol, wandering the narrow, tree-lined streets, where the smell of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the scent of flowers beginning to bloom in the gardens. The sun's glare reflected off the store windows, creating a play of light that danced across the cobblestone pavement, where hurried residents and curious tourists mingled. The sounds of cars and conversations blended into a constant murmur as I observed the daily life of the city. People of all ages passed each other on the sidewalks, some rushing with their appointments, others stopping for a brief conversation with friends and neighbors. Children laughed and ran towards the school, while the elderly, with slow and careful steps, made their way to the local market. Suddenly, my eyes were drawn to a figure that stood out from the crowd. She was an elderly woman. Her snow-white hair framed a face marked by deep wrinkles, each line telling a story of life, of laughter and tears. She was dressed in a long skirt and worn coat, which seemed to have been elegant in another era. His hands, trembling, held tightly to a crumpled piece of paper. His blue eyes, now clouded with age, reflected a mixture of confusion and despair. She looked around, lost, as if she was looking for something or someone, but didn't know where to start. The paper in his hands appeared to be a letter, or perhaps a note with an address, now barely legible due to wear and tear. His expression touched me immediately. There was something about his posture, the way his hunched shoulders supported an invisible burden, that cried out for help. I approached her, trying to hide my apprehension. The town was small, and each familiar face brought with it a familiar story, but this lady was a stranger among familiar faces. She looked up as I approached, and I could see a flicker of hope mixed with silent fear, as if she were on the verge of an emotional breakdown. The lady, who introduced herself with a slight tremor in her voice as Margaret Thompson, approached me with a desolate look, which seemed to carry the weight of countless sleepless nights. The tears, which flowed silently down her wrinkled cheeks, glistened in the sun, reflecting a sadness that seemed infinite. "Please, officer," she began, her voice choked with desperation and urgency. "Can you help me? My son, my only son, has been missing for days. I don't know what else to do." Her every word was filled with palpable desperation, a silent plea that resonated in the apparent calm of the morning. Margaret held tightly to the crumpled paper, which I could now see more closely. It was a photograph of a young man with brown hair and a calm look, with a name scrawled on the back. His eyes, despite his age, were a mirror of hope and fear, searching for some spark of solidarity or compassion in me. However, at that moment, my mind was occupied with the pressures of the day. I had a never-ending list of tasks to complete, calls to answer, and the growing chaos of the city was beginning to weigh heavily on my shoulders. The cacophony of sirens in the distance, the indistinct voices of passers-by, and the urgency of responsibilities made my head pound. I felt a wave of irritation as I realized that yet another complication had arisen amidst the chaos of the morning. "Sorry, ma'am, but I'm really busy right now," I replied, trying to maintain a professional tone, but my impatience showed. Margaret took a step back, as if my response was an unexpected blow. His shoulders, already bowed by age and pain, seemed to collapse even further under the weight of rejection. She tried to speak again, but her voice was swallowed by the surrounding noise. I felt a pang of guilt, but the pressure and hustle and bustle of the morning kept me moving forward, ignoring his grief and the growing sense that I was making a huge mistake. She stood there, looking lost, as I walked away, fighting the storm of conflicting feelings that was beginning to rise within me. In an impulsive and reckless gesture, driven by stress and overload of responsibilities, I reached out and pushed Margaret aside. "Sorry, ma'am, but I'm busy. Seek help elsewhere," he said in a tone that sounded harsher than he intended. I didn't have time to deal with yet another complication amidst the growing confusion of the day. Margaret, surprised by my abruptness, took a staggering step back. His fragile body, already weakened by the weight of years, faltered under the impact. Her eyes, filled with silent pleading, widened in shock as she struggled to maintain her balance. His thin arms flailed in the air, desperately searching for something to hold on to, but found nothing but emptiness. She stumbled, her feet dragging across the cobblestone floor, and for a brief moment, it looked like she might fall. The sight of her exposed fragility and her dignity about to be crushed by my rude gesture caused a wave of discomfort to wash over me. It was as if I could feel the impact of my insensitivity on his trembling, tired body. I hesitated for a moment. A brief flash of regret crossed my mind, but my frustration and desire to move on spoke louder. As she struggled to regain her balance, I looked away, trying to ignore the growing sense of guilt that crept into my heart. I continued on my way, quickly moving away from the scene, trying to stifle the remorse that threatened to overflow within me. The noise of the city seemed to intensify, drowning out any trace of compassion I might have felt. Every step I took me further away from Margaret and the opportunity to right my wrong. His anguished face, a mixture of fear and disappointment, was etched in my mind as I walked away, aware that I had failed as a police officer and, more importantly, as a human being. Try as I might, I couldn't get Margaret's image out of my thoughts. The scene of her desperate struggle to remain standing after my thoughtless act became a constant shadow, reminding me that, in that moment of weakness, I had ignored the humanity we shared. As I walked through the busy streets of Maplewood, the weight of my actions began to press down on my chest. The image of Margaret, her face marked by anguish and despair, could not leave my mind. His pleading expression and the eyes that looked to me for one last hope echoed in my consciousness like a silent scream. Every step I took felt heavier, weighed down by the guilt that slowly began to creep in. My legs carried me mechanically to a nearby cafe, a temporary refuge where I hoped to find some relief. The strong aroma of freshly brewed coffee and the familiar sound of clinking cups created a welcoming atmosphere, but my heart was far from finding solace. I ordered a black coffee, in an attempt to clear the thoughts that were tormenting me. While I waited, my eyes wandered around the place, but nothing could dispel the persistent image of the elderly woman. I sat at a table in the corner, trying to avoid other people's gaze, feeling increasingly isolated in my own remorse. The first drop of hot coffee ran down my throat, but it didn't bring the expected comfort. Instead, each sip felt like a bitter reminder of what I had done. Guilt, like a restless shadow, began to eat away at the surface of my consciousness. I began to reflect on my actions more clearly, and a feeling of despair settled in my chest. How could I be so inhumane, so insensitive to the suffering of someone who was clearly in need? I realized that in the heat of the moment, I had allowed stress and irritation to cloud my judgment, turning me into someone I didn't recognize. Margaret was not just any old lady. She was a desperate mother in search of her son, and I had failed miserably to offer her the help she needed. I looked at the distorted reflection of my image in the cafe window, seeing not just a police officer, but a man who had set aside compassion and empathy at a crucial moment. The feeling of having betrayed my own principles was overwhelming. I had always believed that my duty was to protect and serve, but that morning, I had done neither. Instead, he had contributed to the suffering of someone already so beaten down by life. As I finished my coffee, the bitterness of the drink seemed to mix with the taste of my own guilt. I knew I needed to do something to correct my mistake, but the uncertainty about how to proceed left me paralyzed. The cruel reality was that I had been negligent, and now all that was left was to find a way to repair the damage I had caused. I rose from the table with new purpose, determined to find Margaret and offer the help I had so brutally denied. As the guilt took root deep in my heart, I made the decision to take action and look for Margaret. I knew I needed to correct the mistake I had made, that I needed to do the right thing. The image of her, helpless and lost, wouldn't leave me alone. I hurriedly left the cafe, my step determined and my mind focused on the mission of finding her. I stopped some passers-by, trying to describe Margaret in as much detail as possible. "Did you see an elderly woman with white hair wearing an old coat and holding a crumpled piece of paper?" I asked repeatedly. Some just shook their heads, not noticing anything, while others offered sympathetic looks but no useful information. I felt time passing like sand slipping through my fingers, and the urgency increased. I continued my search, crossing streets and turning corners, hoping that someone had seen Margaret. My thoughts were a mix of regret and determination as I remembered every detail of his face and posture. Each person he met felt like a new chance, a new ray of hope that someone would know his whereabouts. Finally, after a few failed attempts, a young man, who was holding a shopping bag, nodded. Yes, I saw her. She was walking towards the square. She seemed to be looking for something or someone. I quickly thanked him and headed to the square, my heart pounding at the possibility of finally meeting Margaret. Arriving at the square, I looked around carefully. The square was a busy place, with children playing, street vendors, and people walking their dogs. It was a scene of everyday life, where Margaret's presence seemed to clash with her aura of despair and incessant search. My eyes swept the place until, in a more secluded corner, I spotted a familiar figure. There she was, sitting on a bench, her shoulders slumped and her head bowed. The crumpled paper was still in her hands, and she seemed to be deep in sad thoughts. His face reflected a deep sadness, and with each passing second, I felt the weight of my negligence increase. I approached cautiously, fearing that she might be frightened by my sudden presence. I felt a mixture of relief and anxiety when I saw her, but also a renewed determination to fix what I had broken. I knew that this was the moment to show that, despite the mistake, I was there to help and that I would not repeat the indifference from before. Margaret was sitting on a weathered wooden bench next to a bed of flowers that swayed gently in the breeze. The square, with its ancient trees and the constant murmur of distant conversations, contrasted with the solitude evident in his posture. She held the crumpled paper with trembling hands, as if that small piece of hope was the only remaining link to her missing son. I approached her with cautious steps, each carrying a weight of regret that seemed to grow more unbearable with each meter. Shame burned in my chest like an uncomfortable flame, reminding me of the coldness with which I had treated her before. My heart was beating fast, and I could feel the sweat running down my forehead as I tried to find the right words to express my regret. Mrs. Margaret, I began, my voice hesitant and choppy with emotion. I'm sorry about what happened earlier. I was rude and insensitive, and there's no excuse for that. I sincerely want to help find your son. My words came out with palpable sincerity, filled with a silent plea for forgiveness that I knew I desperately needed. Margaret slowly looked up, her gaze a mixture of deep sadness and tiredness. His blue eyes, now dull with grief, met mine, and for a moment, the world around us seemed to stop. Time seemed suspended in that silent exchange of glances, where I hoped, with a heavy heart, that she could see beyond my mistake and find some hope in my words. She nodded slowly, an almost imperceptible movement, but one that carried an immense weight of acceptance. His silence was deafening, and deep in his eyes, I could see a glimmer of reluctant hope. The hand holding the crumpled paper was shaking slightly, and I realized that, despite everything, she had not yet completely lost faith in human kindness. Speechless, Margaret handed me the crumpled paper. It was a photograph of a young man with a calm expression, the features of his face looking vaguely familiar. The name Michael was written on the back in shaky handwriting. I looked at the image, feeling a pang in my heart as I imagined the desperation of that mother, who now depended on a stranger to find her son. We will find him, Ms. Margaret, I promised, my voice firm but full of empathy. Let's do this together. I knew I couldn't undo what I had done, but I could try to repair the damage. I reached out my hand to help her up, and together we began the journey that I hoped would lead us to Michael. As we walked side by side, a new determination grew within me, strengthening my commitment to do what was right and not to fail again with this woman who, despite everything, trusted me. Margaret and I spent the rest of the day side by side, crossing the busy streets and exploring the city's darkest corners, searching for any clue as to the whereabouts of her son, Michael. At every turn, with every look of indifference we received, Michael's story became more painfully real to me. He was a young man who, like so many others, had strayed from the right path, attracted to bad company and wrong choices. Her story, told in snatches of conversation and whispers between Margaret's tears, was an ordinary but deeply moving tragedy. Michael, according to Margaret, had always been a sensitive and intelligent boy, but life had taken him down a difficult path. He got involved with the wrong friends, was seduced by empty promises of an easy life and ended up distancing himself from his family. His disappearance was abrupt, leaving behind a trail of worries and an unbearable void in his mother's heart. Our search took us to diverse locations, from dark, decaying alleys where shadows seemed to hide dark secrets, to shelters and care centers, where hope and despair coexisted in a fragile balance. We asked traders who knew every face in the neighborhood, homeless people who watched the movement with attentive eyes, and cafe goers, where each conversation seemed to carry a piece of the puzzle we were trying to solve. "Have you seen this young man?" Margaret asked in a broken voice, showing Michael's photograph to anyone willing to listen. Her trembling hands held the image with the same tenderness and despair of a mother who still believed in the return of her son. The responses ranged from confused looks to negative ones, and occasionally someone would offer a vague clue, a glimmer of hope that motivated us to keep going. With each person we asked, the determination within me grew. I saw the exhaustion in Margaret's eyes, but also the unwavering flame of hope. She trusted me to bring Michael back, and that drove me forward, even when hope seemed like a distant, fragile light at the end of a dark tunnel. At one of the community centers we visited, a volunteer informed us that a young man with Michael's characteristics had recently been seen seeking help. The news brought a glimmer of hope to Margaret's eyes, and I felt a new breath of determination as I saw the possibility of a resolution approaching. Every place we visited, every person we approached, was one more step towards finding Michael. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the streets, when we finally obtained more concrete information. A homeless shelter worker recalled seeing a young man matching Michael's description, visibly haggard and lost, looking for a place to spend the night. With this new track, we felt like we were finally on the right track. The physical exhaustion that weighed on us seemed to lessen as we approached finding Michael. Margaret, even tired and worn out by pain and worry, remained firm by my side, determined to bring her son home. And I, motivated by his strength and the responsibility to make amends for my mistake, committed myself not to rest until Michael was found and hope was restored. As we walked through the narrow, busy streets, stopping at every corner and talking to anyone who could give us a clue, our search began to feel like a never-ending emotional marathon. Margaret, despite her obvious tiredness, kept a flame of hope alive in her eyes, something that motivated me to move forward. In one of these moments of almost despair, we met a young man with a worn appearance and tired eyes, but who I immediately recognized as a possible friend of Michael's. He was sitting on the step of a closed shop, smoking a cigarette, when Margaret showed him a photo of her son. "Yeah, I know this guy," he said, his voice hoarse and tired. "Michael was at the Elm Street shelter last week. He was in a difficult situation, but he was there. I think you can still find him if you're quick." Margaret's heart skipped a beat, and I felt a new energy pulse within me. This was the first concrete lead we had in days. We hurried towards the shelter, our urgent footsteps echoing across the asphalt as night began to fall. Elm Street was in a more run-down area of town, where the buildings were old and the windows were often broken or boarded up. The shelter was an old brick building, with a weathered sign that still gleamed dimly in the streetlights. We entered the shelter, where the smell of food and the murmur of low conversations created a welcoming atmosphere, despite the evident sadness. The main hall was filled with people of all ages, each carrying their own stories of struggle and survival. I looked around, trying to spot Michael in the crowd, but it was difficult to identify anyone specific in the sea of tired faces. Margaret, with Michael's photo in her hands, approached one of the volunteers. "My name is Margaret Thompson, and I'm looking for my son, Michael. He was here recently." Her voice trembled with expectation and fear, as if each word was a silent plea for a miracle. The volunteer, a middle-aged man with a friendly face, looked at the photo and nodded slowly. "Yes, I recognize him. Michael is here, but he is in a delicate situation. Come with me." My heart pounded as we followed the man down a narrow hallway, each step increasing the tension within me. Margaret's hope seemed almost tangible, as if she were holding onto a thread of light that could snap at any moment. We arrived at a small room at the back of the shelter, where Michael was sitting in a chair, hunched over and staring at the floor. He looked like a shadow of the young man in the photograph, his face haggard and his body visibly thin. Pain and fatigue marked every line of his face, but he was alive. Margaret let out a sigh of relief and ran towards him, falling to her knees beside him and wrapping him in a tight hug. "Michael, my darling, thank God I found you," she whispered through tears as she stroked her son's disheveled hair. Michael, initially in shock, slowly looked up and, upon seeing his mother, let out a muffled sob, hugging her back tightly. It was a moment of pure relief and emotion, where the hope that seemed lost now materialized before us. I stood, watching the scene with a mixture of relief and satisfaction. I had managed to correct my mistake and, more importantly, I had helped reunite a family that had almost fallen apart. The hope that was reborn in that moment was a testament to the strength of love and persistence, and I knew that, despite everything, Margaret and Michael now had a new chance to rebuild their lives. The reunion between Margaret and Michael was one of the most touching moments I have ever witnessed in my life. The room where they found themselves seemed filled with palpable emotional tension, as if all the feelings pinned up over the days of anguish were finally about to be released. Margaret, her eyes full of tears, advanced toward Michael with an intensity that seemed to transcend time and space. Her fragile body, fueled by the strength of maternal love, propelled her forward, ignoring any pain or accumulated fatigue. She knelt down beside Michael, wrapping him in a hug so tight it seemed like she wanted to protect him from all the suffering he had faced. His arms, although fragile, were a fortress of tenderness and protection. Michael, initially surprised by his mother's presence, remained static for a brief moment, as if he could not believe the reality in front of him. His eyes, which previously reflected deep sadness and despair, were now filled with tears that slowly ran down his dirty, thin cheeks. He raised a shaky, hesitant hand to touch Margaret's face, as if he needed to feel the reality of her presence to believe it. "Forgive me, Mother," he said, his voice broken by crying, barely able to form the words. I'm sorry for all the pain and worry I've caused. I didn't want to leave you like this." His words were punctuated by sobs, each carrying the burden of days and nights of guilt and regret. Margaret, unable to contain her own tears, just shook her head and hugged Michael even tighter to her, as if to ensure he would never escape her embrace again. "It doesn't matter, my son. The important thing is that you are here now, that you are alive. That's all that matters," she whispered in a shaky voice, each word filled with unconditional love and renewed hope. The room around us seemed to dissolve in that moment, leaving only the raw, heartfelt emotion between mother and son. I, standing a few meters away, observed the scene with a mixture of happiness and relief. I felt a wave of gratitude for having had the chance to correct my mistake and provide that moment of reunion and reconciliation. It was as if the weight of my guilt was slowly being lifted, replaced by a sense of accomplishment. Every tear that ran down Michael's face and every gesture of affection from Margaret were testaments to the power of love and forgiveness. The gleam of hope in Margaret's eyes, the silent strength that had kept her going through the days of searching, now found its purpose in that tight embrace. And Michael, hugging her, seemed to finally find a safe haven in the midst of the storm that had become his life. As I watched the reunion, I felt a deep inner peace. I knew that, although I couldn't erase the past or the difficulties faced, I had helped bring a little light to the darkness that surrounded Margaret and Michael. It was a powerful reminder that even in the worst circumstances, there is always a chance for redemption and a fresh start. The muffled sound of sobs and Margaret's comforting whispers filled the room, creating an atmosphere of renewal and hope. And there, in that small homeless shelter, in the middle of a city that often seemed indifferent, I witnessed the beauty of humanity in its purest form. That night, as I drove home, surrounded by the reassuring silence of the car's interior, my thoughts were a whirlwind of reflections and learning. The road before me seemed to stretch out like a metaphor for the emotional journey I had been on throughout the day. Every kilometer covered was a reminder of the impulsive and thoughtless action that, in a moment of haste and frustration, caused so much unnecessary suffering. The brightness of the headlights illuminated the darkness of the road, reflecting the duality of light and shadow that permeated my mind. The words and actions of that day replayed over and over in my head, each scene playing like a movie. The initial rejection of Margaret, her expression of pain and despair, and finally, the emotional reunion with her son, Michael. Every detail was burned into my memory, as if each moment was trying to teach me something I needed to deeply understand. I realized that, in my rush and my desire to get rid of yet another complication, I had ignored the essence of my work, empathy and patience. I learned that as a police officer, I am not only a defender of the law, but also a guardian of dignity and respect for each individual I encounter. Each person who crosses my path has a unique story, filled with their own struggles, hopes, and challenges. And it is my duty to recognize and respect that. Remembering Margaret, her quiet strength, and her unconditional love for Michael, I understood the profound impact a simple action can have on someone's life. My initial attitude of indifference almost destroyed the hope of a desperate mother, but it also gave me the opportunity to redeem myself and make a difference. It was a powerful reminder that every choice, every word, and every gesture has the potential to create or destroy, to save or hurt. I promised myself, in that moment of introspection, never again to rush to judge someone who seeks help. Never again allow tiredness or stress to cloud my humanity and compassion. I would always remember Margaret and how much my attitude, whether negative or positive, can transform the lives of people who cross my path. Michael's return to his mother's arms was not only a family reunion, but also a valuable lesson for me. The road before me, now clear and illuminated, symbolized not only the path back home, but also a new direction in my life and career. A direction where empathy, respect, and understanding would be my guides, illuminating each step and decision. As the night enveloped the outside world in silent tranquility, I felt a sense of inner peace. I knew that from that day forward, every person I encountered would be treated with the dignity and respect they deserve. And so, driving down the dark, silent road, with a lighter heart and a clearer mind, I promised myself to be the change I wanted to see in the world, one step at a time, one act of empathy and compassion at a time.